Okay, welcome. What I'm going to cover today is the topics of 6.1, which is the motives for imperialism, and then 6.2, which is state expansion, which goes right along with that. So we're going to walk through this, give you the notes for these two things, and then 6.3, I believe it is, or one of the other ones, you're going to read the textbook and annotate one of these pages, and all that stuff is in the lesson planner for this week. So anyway, we're basically done with period 5. The period 5 test will happen this week. It will be posted. You have a few things to do before then, as I mentioned in the announcement, the video announcement for this week. So let's get into the notes for beginning topic 6, which is about imperialism and the effects that this has across the globe. And I want to share my screen here and walk through the PowerPoint that we have here. Okay, so these are the topics that we're covering. So we're looking at for the motives of imperialism. And one thing that we have to get to in this century, this is the 19th century, is the incredible impact of the publishing of Darwin's book called The Origin of Species, which he published in 1859. And we know that Darwin's work is important in biology class, but it also has incredible consequences when it comes to history. And basically Darwin redefined his theory of evolution. He came up with his theory called natural selection about where all these species came from. And that book was just enormously influential, as we all know. And it's going to lead to this incredible rapid colonization around the world. As you see here, the stuff in red is just the British Empire at the end of the 19th century, just the British Empire. The little island up there in the north part of Europe colonized this massive empire. And one of the motives, one of the rationales was really derived from the work of Darwin. So let's look at why Darwin was so significant. Now, we think about the struggle that takes on, that species go through. We think of the struggle to survive, how the cheetah chases the gazelles across the African savannah, and they lunge out and they grab the weakest one and pull it down and start eating it. It's kind of a violent thing. It's because that one was the slowest one. And Darwin said that what that actually does is it brings progress, because it weeds out the weak ones, and the weak ones then don't pass on that weakness to their offspring. The ones at the front of the pack run the fastest, and they will pass that attribute to their offspring, and so the species gets stronger and stronger by this process of weeding out the weak. And basically what Darwin did is he completely redefined what progress was in speciation, in evolution. And his idea of progress was this. He said, progress is a violent struggle to the death in which the strong overpower the weak. In other words, those images of violence, of the lion tearing into a prey that it captured, notwithstanding our emotional response to that, for Darwin, that was progress. That's progress taking place. Now, outside of evolution, what happened is people began to apply that idea to societies. They began to think in industry and in civilizations and in nations. The strongest survive. What happens to a nation that refuses to industrialize, for example, that refuses to become strong? Well, it's going to be thrown into the trash can of history, because it's the strongest ones that survive. And that idea was taken, as I mentioned, out of evolution and applied to the way people think about societies, civilizations, and industry. And when that happens, the name for that, and this is absolutely required that you know this, the name for that is social Darwinism. Social Darwinism. It's the idea that societies operate the same way, that there's no room for weakness, that they must strive to be strong, because that is what progress is. So this is embodied in a very famous poem written by Kipling in the late 19th century, and British schoolboys learned this poem. It was called The White Man's Burden. And you can see this. And by the way, the topic here is rationales for imperialism. What justified imperialism? And this idea did. The strong overpowering the weak. And you see that in this famous poem by Kipling called The White Man's Burden. Here's an illustration to that. You see the British people, the fat guy in the back and the guy in the front, they're being carried by people of color. So obviously these ideas today don't have any bearing, and they're of course extremely unpopular today. But look at a line from this poem called The White Man's Burden. Kipling writes, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons in exile to serve your captives' need." Think about that for a second. Breeding the best you can be. And go, this is basically justifying the act of colonizing other people and serving their needs. You're helping them out. It continues, "To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught, sullen peoples, half devil and half child." And that's a description of colonized people. From the British point of view, this is people of color. And colonization will spread in this time period into India, into China, and across Asia, and into Africa. And this is the idea. By the way, this idea of social Darwinism, this leads to this concept of the civilizing mission that Europe has. White people have this obligation to take over weaker and bring them up to the level of the British or European civilization. And so to go out and conquer new areas is for their own good. Now, you didn't have this in the imperialism that took place after Columbus. And that's when the Spanish and the Portuguese and then the British and the French and everyone colonized the New World. Here you have something very different. It's like you're doing them a favor. So the white man's burden is what this is called based on this poem, the idea of civilizing other people by taking them over. I mean, they're weaker anyway, and we're the stronger ones. So it also led to something that was even worse, much worse than that. Social Darwinism led to something called scientific racism. And by the way, Darwin himself did not support either of these applications of his concepts. He was not a social Darwinist, and he did not believe in this next idea called scientific racism. And that's the idea that the stronger races have an obligation to take over and it depends on how this is interpreted, and sometimes even, as we see in the 20th century, exterminate the weaker races. Just like the lion takes out the weaker one of the pack. That some races have a mission in history to make humanity better, and that's by eliminating the weaker elements or the weaker races. And this spills over all over the place. This will justify European colonizing Africa, as we'll see, and India, and in Asia, and so forth. And it reaches to the United States. The United States at this time period, I mean, at the end of the 19th century, the U.S. will become an imperial power. It will go to war against Spain and take Cuba and the Philippines and other areas. But as it expands westward into new territory that's becoming states, you'll see this idea in terms of the Native Americans. And I want to share just one excerpt from a newspaper, and this is from a newspaper called The Pioneer. And basically, he's complaining here. This is after the Wounded Knee Massacre, when Native Americans massacred some white U.S. Army people, their soldiers, and he's blaming the general here who wasn't able to take care of the Indians and brought loss of blood to our soldiers. And then that second paragraph, he says something remarkable. He says, "The Pioneer," which is this newspaper, "has before declared that our only safety depends upon the total extermination of the Indians. Having wronged them for centuries, we had better, in order to protect our civilization, follow it up by one more wrong, and right these untamed and untamable creatures from the face of the earth. In this lies future safety of our settlers and soldiers." That's remarkably it's an incredible statement to see this is published in a newspaper. And by the way, this is written by someone that you may be familiar with his other work. This is Frank Baum. This is the author of the famous book and turned into a movie called The Wizard of Oz. So this is the author of The Wizard of Oz. And he's a journalist, and he called for the extermination of Native Americans. So it was, what happens in the 20th century in Nazi Germany was part of unfortunately, a part of how many people were viewing things. And the idea of wiping out a race was not something that the Germans just came up with out of the blue. There was a cultural context going on here. So this is the idea. Now, what's going to happen is the colonies, the American colonies, the 13 British colonies, the Spanish colonies, Portugal's, Brazil, all those at the beginning of this period, as you already know, at the beginning of 1750, they all got independence. So those colonies were now independent states. They were not subject to future colonization. And in the New World, in the Americas, the United States took a stand on that in the Monroe Doctrine and said there cannot be any colonization anymore. So basically, with all these colonies getting independence, the European powers, remember, they needed raw materials. They needed markets to sell to. So they began to look at other places in the world which in the previous period did not get colonized. Remember, Europe had great success in the Americas in the last period after Columbus, but they weren't so successful in the Indian Ocean region. And China stood up, and India remained independent. And Africa, no one had really been in Africa other than the Portuguese on the coast, Angola. So what happened is, with Africa there, full of incredible raw materials, Europeans decided to have a go at Africa. And this meeting that you see right here is called the Congress of Berlin, the Berlin Conference, and it was held in 1885. And these are the leaders of European countries. These are the leaders of European countries plotting to colonize Africa. So here they are in Berlin. Notice there's not a single person of color here. The Africans are not involved in this. They have no idea what's about to happen. And here they set the ground rules. And this is really not to help the Africans. This is to prevent the Europeans from going to war with each other. Rules about how you can claim a territory, how you have to have infrastructure. You have to have so many people there before you can claim it. You can't do like Spain did after 1492 and just throw a flag down and say, everything here is ours. So they're basically creating the rules for conquest. And when the meeting was over, it's as if someone fired a gun in the air to start the race. And what began was this thing called the Great Scramble for Africa. As European nations, the French, the British, the Germans, the newly established nation of Germany, Belgium, they all pounced on Africa. And this was the quickest and vastest colonization that took place in history, as the entire continent in about a decade and a half or 2 decades was almost completely colonized, as they jumped in to take the raw materials that they could. They were motivated by something called economic imperialism, and this is to get what you can from a colony, get the resources, as we'll look at here. So when they jumped down on Africa, you can see here the pattern of colonization. France got that enormous area, the green area there. You can read the legend here. You can see what Britain got. Most of Africa was colonized, a lot of it in 15 years. But this shows you from 1885, which is the Berlin Conference, up to right before World War I. And the nations of Europe almost went to war here as they fought over Africa's land. Now, in terms of colonization, you have two different ways, two different reasons that colonies were made during this time, and one type of colony was called a settler colony. A settler colony. And a settler colony, you also have economic imperialism. Now, what a settler colony is, it's a colony that was meant just for people from the colonizing nation to go live in. So, for example, you see the very north part of Africa in the green. The region at the north was called Algeria, and Algeria wasn't pillaged for raw materials. Algeria was a place for French people to go and live and settle, and they built up the capital to look like French streets, look like Paris, with French restaurants, and about 1 million French people went and lived there. And of course, they were the dominant ones in society. There were areas where the indigenous people were not allowed to go, and they were assigned to the poorer parts of cities, and the French acted as if Algeria was simply theirs. And Algeria was just kind of absorbed into the French government, almost as if it was another state. And the reason that's important is because when the independence movements come after World War II, the settler colonies get really messy because the white people, the French people living there, do not want their Algerian country to get independence. They want it to stay connected to their historic homeland, and they'll clash with the indigenous people there intensely. So you have something called settler colonies, and there will be others around the world as well. Now, the other thing was economic imperialism. They wanted to get raw materials, because you remember that imperial nations, industrial nations, need massive amounts of raw materials. They also need markets to sell to. And so the British, the French, Belgians jumped in there to try to get as many raw materials as they possibly could. And the light green area right in the middle, we're going to watch a little film clip about that. This is the colony of Belgium, Congo, which was owned by Belgium. And the Belgians went into Congo because in the Second Industrial Revolution, which, as you remember from last week, was this more technical revolution with motors and belts and gaskets, and also the telegraph is important. And all those things required rubber, tires and everything. So Congo was full of rubber trees. And I'm going to show you a short clip, or a short video clip in just a minute, and you'll see the horror of what happened there as the Belgians colonized and put quotas on the indigenous people that they had to turn in so much raw rubber. And the king of Belgium, King Leopold II, made a fortune exploiting the people there. That was economic imperialism. And all of Africa was basically colonized. What I want to look at, and there's Africa today, and the colonization of Africa will lead to a lot of problems when Africa gets independence. Because if you look back here, when these colonies were made, they didn't care at all. The Europeans did not care at all where indigenous tribes had their own historic territory. Their lines would combine tribes that tended not to get along, or the way they drew the lines sometimes split tribes or split African societies in half, cut people off from some of their sacred land or burial land, and it's going to cause major problems when they get independence, because the lines were not drawn for the benefit of the Africans. They were designed by the Europeans who went on a land grab. And the infrastructure of Africa was built to extract raw materials, not to benefit the people who live there. So when Africa gets independence, it's going to be really hampered by the fact that Africa was developed to be a source of raw materials for other nations. So I'm going to close by just looking at some new methods of colonial management in this time period. And basically, this is in topic 6.2. European nations found it easier to really grip and control their colonies much better than they ever had before, and for these reasons. First of all, steam power, steamships, and the train allowed enormous movement of raw materials. And that's obviously that's going to help with industrialization. They could use steamships to go where they needed to go, and that was a lot faster and more direct than wind. And most importantly is the telegraph. The telegraph allowed communication along vast distances. There was a telegraph cable dropped between London and New York City later. But a very important one was the telegraph that went from London across the English Channel, across Europe and the Mediterranean to Alexandria, Egypt, and from Egypt connected through various segments and ended up in India. And as we'll see in another live session, Britain colonized India in this time period. And now it only took 3 hours to get a message to and from India. Instead of sailing all the way around Africa, I mean, look at this on the map for a second. Look at where Britain is up here. And Britain used to have to, in order to communicate with India, get a ship all the way around Africa and then to India. Now the telegraph cable connects immediately, and they can find out about the market immediately. They can adjust prices on a day-to-day level. So the telegraph and steam power allows nations to tighten their grip and micromanage their colonies instead of just a few viceroys who are kind of trying to do what the king wants, and often using local indigenous people to help in the administration. The Europeans now can directly control their colonies. Another thing is new canals. I want to go back to this picture again. You all know the Panama Canal. That was built in the 20th century, right before World War I. But significantly, here is the Suez Canal, built right here, connecting the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. So, and the British and the French paid for that. And they didn't do this to help world travel. They did this so they could use that shortcut to project power on their colonies. And by the way, it benefited not Egypt, where that canal went, but it benefited the British and the French. So with the Suez Canal, ships could get over here much quicker. And this is different than the colonization that the Spanish did in the previous time period, because just men went over. But now that there is direct access, you don't have to sail around Africa, you can communicate through telegraph. Sometimes British took their families over there, and that meant you don't have that racial mix that you did with Creoles and everything else in the New World. Also, the ideas of social Darwinism, British became less sympathetic to the culture of South Asians, and they just scorned Hinduism. And instead of tolerating it, they thought, you guys just need to stop that. So they thought of their own culture as superior. And they're going to teach that in the schools that they're going to make in India. They're going to teach English and British history. So you have British in control more, and they're not really depending on indigenous people to help them rule. So new canals. You also have the industrial power that's going to give them a huge boost. Industrial power is going to generate enormous wealth for them, and also the new weapons, industrial weapons, are going to allow Britain and France and the United States and other imperial nations to project power. And we'll see this is what the United States plays this game too. The U.S. jumps in, and the United States begins to use its military power, its navy, to coerce Japan to open up to trade. We will talk about that next time. So that's another method of colonial control. And then I mentioned this, there's also going to be less indigenous management or control for all of these reasons. They're going to stop depending on locals to help them run, and they're going to be very less empathetic towards local culture. Remember there's the social Darwinism again, the idea that we're superior. We don't, you guys need to become more like us. So these are not all, but these are the basic tenements of what you see in 6.1, topic 6.1, and topic 6.2. Now, topic 6.2 has more here, and these topic pages in 6 blend together a little bit, but it's essential that you know the Great Scramble for Africa, the meeting called the Berlin Conference, and I know some of you tuned in late, and that's my fault because I was late posting the date, the time for this, so this is all being recorded. So you have the Berlin Conference, you have the colonization of Africa, and in the next live session, we're going to talk about the British in India and the British in China. So to recap, The first great wave of imperialism was in the previous time period, 1450 to 1750. In that time period, it was basically in the Americas, Africa, Asia, China, East Asia. They were able to kind of push back the Europeans, and Europeans had to learn to play their game. In this time period, because of industrialization, Africa, India, and China will collapse to European control. And this new imperialism will be based on the needs of industrial states. It will be brutish. I'm going to post a link for you to watch. I mean, this is not a boring video. It's actually quite graphic. It's the BBC. The BBC has a documentary series. I think it's called The History of Racism, and there's a little 9-minute section that moves away from talking about slavery in the Americas, and then it moves to what the Belgians did in the Congo. And I tell you, they remade some scenes in like Steven Spielberg realism that you'll know what I'm talking about. It shows the brutality that they had on indigenous people. And once again, social Darwinism, the idea that some civilizations were just kind of destined, they're superior, and they're destined to conquer others. And remember, at the very beginning we said, Darwin redefined progress, where progress occurs through a violent struggle to the death, in which the strong overpower the weak. It's just the way things are. And that gave what they thought was a scientific justification for taking over other people. And it got really worse, in conclusion, with scientific racism, which would lead to what you'll see in Belgium and, of course, culminate in the Holocaust in the last period in the 20th century.